the findings that I came up with were not totally unexpected, and yet there were a few surprises in a way, because this is not a new question. I personally have done workshops on it previously. But what I found was that people said they had policies, but the policies were very hard to nail down. Nobody could really produce a policy when I asked for one. And I found that the policies were somehow included in the internal documents of the congregation, their constitutions, directives, whatever documents they have, and were somehow assumed, or it was somehow assumed that if there was a general health screening, HIV would be part of that. The other thing that was very striking was that many people, especially those who were not major superiors, and I had some of them fill out the questionnaire as well, they were saying things like, I don't know if there is a policy, or only the formation people know that, and that kind of thing. So there was kind of a lack of knowledge of whether some such thing existed or not. Another finding was that certainly among the women's religious congregations, there was a willingness for them to disclose, to say, yes, we do have people who are on treatment. There wasn't the same finding among the men's congregations and among the bishops, but that is not unexpected because the sample was very small. The bishops did not really answer the questionnaire. And some of the religious congregations came back later. When I actually presented the findings, I got some more results, which I didn't incorporate into the actual paper that I wrote. The findings were actually very similar. And it didn't actually make much difference to the number of men's congregations that participated. There were a few more, but not too many more. Most of the answers came from the women's congregations. And then what they told me about the treatment was that some of the people who are on treatment are treated in the public sector. In other words, they don't pay for the treatment. And then some, they pay for the treatment themselves. So for whatever reasons, they've been able to make those distinctions. Another finding that was kind of interesting, because I had never really set out to find that, but it came kind of accidentally, was that some of the international congregations that were surveyed were able to give data from other countries in Africa and possibly elsewhere in the world, rather than in South Africa where they were living. Sometimes because they were newcomers to the scene, and maybe that's possibly the main reason. So they were really claiming that they didn't know what was going on. So it's possible that there's less HIV than one would perhaps expect, or that people really don't know, or that all that are known to be HIV positive, certainly among the respondents, are known. You know, they've kind of declared all of them. But what you correctly say is that the Catholic clergy and Catholic religious are not as easily coming forward and saying, I'm positive and it's okay and all of that kind of thing. And I personally have really only heard one priest in Africa, one Catholic priest in Africa, openly declaring his status. But what I think we are struggling with is this whole question, among other things, it's probably not the total answer, but the question of stigma and taboo and all of that kind of thing around the whole question of celibacy, because obviously celibacy is special within the Catholic Church and maybe not in some of the other denominations. I know there are some other churches that maybe some of their religious are celibate, but not the clergy as a whole. And so what I think we're looking at there is the kind of stigma that comes from the church, from the wider local church, expecting priests and religious to be celibate and then finding they're not, and So there's a kind of a judgment and a discrimination, perhaps, or perceived. I don't think it's always there. I think sometimes people say it's there when in fact it's not. But linked to that, I think there is this question of self-stigma. So the individual person who is infected would possibly feel embarrassed and shy and various other emotions, and as a result not be willing to look at it. So I think there's that, and then the church as a whole struggling, so that we have this expectation of ourselves. And obviously this question of stigma and self-stigma is known more widely than just around this issue. So I think it's certainly one aspect that cannot be denied. Yes, and that is of course also a very sad situation, because the congregants or the public at large will make assumptions. Sometimes those assumptions may not be correct. Of course, there could be some other cause of someone's sickness. But what we also find is that clergy perhaps move to another parish, or they go away for treatment or something like that, but they don't disclose. Now, maybe it's hard to disclose to a congregation, but I think what is particularly sad is if that disclosure is not taking place within their religious communities or among their fellow priests within a diocese, because that sort of somehow allows the stigma to continue, or that feeling of isolation, because I would imagine that if one is sort of keeping that secret, it's a hard burden to carry. You know, in addition to carrying the burden of being HIV positive, there's that burden of I can't talk to anybody, you know, which is particularly sad. I think we've moved considerably over the last number of years. I remember doing a workshop a number of years ago involving about 85 sisters only. There were no men were allowed at that particular conference. They came from different countries in Africa. We ran a workshop in South Africa, and they shared their stories. And at that stage, which was before the era of treatment, we heard horror stories of people being isolated and sent home and all of that on one side. And then on the other side, we heard wonderful stories about people being accepted and, you know, cared for in their own communities and so on. But I think even what the survey showed, where people are on treatment now, and the experience that I know from my own congregation, where someone has openly declared her status, if people are able to do that, obviously there's a climate in which that is possible. So I do think we don't experience stigma in quite the same way that we did a number of years ago.